Hey everyone! Welcome to the Bold and Beautiful 24. I'm Alessio, and I'm so excited to have you here. If you love Bold and Beautiful, then you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Alright, let's dive right in. Thomas and Brooke go through hell after Lee knocks Luna out with a knife. Ridge gives Thomas a glare as he continues to yell at him to tell him that Brooke is lying about their marriage at Forrester. As things escalate, Ridge hollers that he walked in to find Thomas's hands on his wife. That will never happen again. He orders his son to accept the marriage confirmation. He tries to convince Thomas that the fight between the women is over, but Thomas, like us, doesn't believe him. Getting real, Ridge reminds Thomas that he's a grown man and this shouldn't concern him. He's had some disappointments, but they'll get him back on track. He's sorry he's upset, but he's responsible, not Brooke. More, Robert Redford's tribute from Ted King sighing, Thomas says at some point it got ingrained in him to blame Brooke. Ridge tells his son that she makes him really happy, which must count. Brooke walks over to Thomas and takes his hand. He takes her other hand in his and hell freezes over as they embrace. Thomas follows up by expressing his love to his dad and they hug too. Brooke Thomas embraces BNB sure, Eric. At the Forrester guest house, Taylor's packing her suitcase when Eric comes in. She's sure he knows what's going on. She mocks the fact that his campaign for Brooke was successful. Eric's quick to update her that Ridge has already married the blonde. He tries to apologize for defending Brooke, but Taylor isn't buying it and launches into the old song and dance about the Logan women playing the Forrester men. Eric declares that Brooke is who Ridge belongs with, and Taylor walks out. BNB Taylor Moore, a new love interest for Taylor? At Bill's place, Katie erupts over Luna taking advantage of Will after his party. Bill characterizes it as her getting him to sleep with her, but sets Will straight when he starts to blame himself. Katie declares that Luna will pay in fumes. Where is she? Will Katie BNB? Who's the new guy? In Remy's apartment, he questions if Luna and Will are meant to be together. She's determined to make it happen. Remy's door opens and a young man named Deke walks in. He's surprised to see the dead woman. He is introduced to Luna by Remy. Deke BNB. It's revealed that Deke and Remy are a couple and live together. Luna reveals his obsession with Elektra. Remy shrugs that the closet is a complicated place, he was hiding who he really was. At that very moment, Lee arrives at home to find Luna missing. Lee BB. A knock comes at the door, it's Will and his fuming parents. Katie declares that they know what she's done. Will inquires, where is Luna? Bill unironically gives Lee hell for giving Luna another chance. Katie hollers that her granddaughter took advantage of their son. Will Bill Lee BB. Over at Remy's place, Deke's beside himself that Remy has a murderer in the apartment. Luna takes the opportunity to duck into the bathroom and ogle her pregnancy test. Deke tells Remy to get rid of her, so he bangs on the bathroom door. Luna emerges and asks for 5 minutes, but Remy merely wishes her luck. She says she won't need it and departs. Deke Remy BNB. More, who is Deke? At Lee's place, Will fills her in on how Luna took advantage of him. Lee recalls the night Luna went out and groans, oh no. Bill hollers, this is your fault. Lee counters that he got her pardoned. Bill argues the blame ball is in her court now. Lee cringes. Luna's played her. Katie, outraged, yells that her son is the victim. Just then, Luna walks in. As Bill pulls her in by the arm, she grins and says, what's this? Meet the parents or something? Katie and Bill lay into her about taking advantage of their son. Certifiable Luna insists that it was unique. Lee hisses that she's just like her mother and throws her up against the door by her throat. You're evil. The day at Forrester Creations began like any other, but it quickly spiraled into something no one expected, a chain of events so volatile and emotionally charged that even the most seasoned Forrester veterans found themselves questioning whether they were watching a family fracture beyond repair or witnessing the first fragile steps toward healing. Ridge stood at the center of the storm, his gaze burning into his son as Thomas ranted, his words spilling out in jagged shards of pain and rage, insisting that Brooke had deceived them all, insisting that the marriage Ridge had sworn to was built on lies, insisting that the woman he had spent so many years resenting would never truly belong in their family no matter how many times Ridge placed a ring on her finger. His voice cracked with desperation, yet he stood firm, shoulders tense, jaw clenched, eyes wide and haunted with the kind of madness that only festers when love, loss, and betrayal intertwine. Ridge, equally raw, snapped back with the weight of authority not just as a father but as a man drawing a line in the sand, bellowing across the room that he had walked in to find his son's hands on his wife, a scene that would forever be burned into his memory as both a warning and a violation, and with his fury laid bare, he declared in no uncertain terms that it would never happen again. The words ricocheted through the room like a gunshot, leaving Thomas momentarily stunned, his tirade stalled by the undeniable reality of his father's wrath. Ridge confirmed, loud, final, unwavering, that he and Brooke were married, bound, and nothing Thomas could scream or accuse would change that, and with the same breath, he demanded that his son accept the truth. But Thomas, stubborn, fractured, and still chained to the grievances of his past, recoiled at the command, his face hardening, his voice dripping with disbelief, because deep inside he couldn't accept it any more than anyone watching believed the war between Brooke and Taylor would ever truly end. He shook his head, muttering under his breath about years of betrayal, about the cycles that never seemed to break, about how much of his misery had been funneled into blaming Brooke, as if she had been written into his DNA as the villain of his story. Ridge, exasperated, took a step closer, his tone shifting from fiery to gutted, reminding his son that he was no longer a boy caught in the crossfire of his parents' choices but a grown man who had to own his decisions, a grown man who had let obsession and anger cloud his judgment for too long. He acknowledged Thomas's disappointments, the missed opportunities, the heartaches that had carved hollows into his soul, but he promised they would find a way to bring him back on track, to rebuild him into the man he was always meant to be. He admitted sorrow for the pain Thomas carried, but he placed the responsibility squarely where it belonged, not on Brooke, not on Ridge, not on destiny or fate, but on Thomas himself. For the first time in what felt like years, the words landed, not as a reprimand but as a plea, and Thomas faltered, his defenses cracking just enough for the boy he once was to slip through, sighing heavily as though the air had been punched from his lungs. He confessed, almost to himself, that somewhere along the way it had been drilled into him to blame Brooke for everything, every disappointment, every fracture in their family, every lonely night spent watching Ridge walk away. The admission hung in the air like smoke, bitter and choking, but also strangely cleansing, because it was the first time he admitted the depth of his conditioning. Ridge, seizing the moment, spoke with unshakable clarity, telling his son that Brooke made him happy, truly happy, in a way that couldn't be measured in mistakes or history but only in the present reality of their love, and he urged Thomas to let that count for something. Brooke, who had stood quietly on the sidelines, torn between fear and compassion, finally stepped forward, her own heart racing with both trepidation and hope. As if she were approaching a wounded animal that could lash out or crumble at the slightest touch, she carefully and slowly crossed the room and extended her hand to Thomas. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, his eyes darting from her face to her fingers, wrestling with every instinct inside him. But then, almost imperceptibly, he reached out and clasped her hand, his grip trembling yet firm, and when she brought her other hand to rest over his, something in the room shifted, something so improbable and shocking that it felt as though the earth itself had tilted. Hell froze over. The eternal enemies, the perpetual rivals locked in decades of resentment and bloodshed by association, stood hand in hand not as combatants but as something dangerously close to allies. Tears threatened in Brooke's eyes, not because she had been vindicated but because she had been seen, and Thomas, in that fragile embrace, allowed a lifetime of fury to melt just slightly into something resembling surrender. The silence was deafening, charged with disbelief, and then Thomas did the unthinkable. He turned toward Ridge, his voice breaking, his expression softening, and he spoke words his father had longed to hear for years. He loved him. He loved his father despite everything, despite the wars, despite the wounds, despite the impossibility of ever fully erasing the damage between them. Ridge, undone, pulled his son into his arms, holding him tightly as though sheer force could keep him from fracturing again. For a heartbeat, the three of them, Ridge, Thomas and Brooke stood in an embrace that should never have been possible, an embrace that looked less like forgiveness and more like survival, but in that moment it didn't matter. It was enough. Forrester Creations, the stage of so many battles, bore witness to something closer to peace than it had in years, and though no one knew how long it would last or whether it was real or just a fleeting illusion, it marked a turning point, the kind of moment soap operas are built upon, where time seems to stop, and Lee choking Luna out, and hell freezing over between Thomas and Brooke, became one of those moments where it felt like the entire canvas of the bold and the beautiful tilted on its axis, because at Forrester Creations, where family wars have always been fought and history repeats itself in cycles of betrayal and heartbreak, Ridge Forrester found himself once again in the position of referee between his son Thomas and his eternal destiny, Brooke Logan, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, because Ridge stood in his office, glaring at Thomas with a fury that came from both a father's disappointment and a husband's territorial instinct, while Thomas, face flushed, still ranted at him, his words sharp and rapid, demanding to know why Ridge was defending Brooke, why he was choosing her again, why he was blinded by what Thomas swore were Brooke's lies about their marriage, and though Thomas tried to project strength, it was clear his desperation was bleeding through, because the more he pushed, the more Ridge pushed back, until Ridge's booming voice filled the room, hollering that he had walked in to find Thomas's hands on his wife, and that was something he would never tolerate again, not as a husband, not as a man, not as a father who had already forgiven too many sins, and he made it crystal clear that he and Brooke were married, that it was real, binding, final, and that his son needed to accept it. End of discussion. No more waffling between women, no more back and forth, no more years of his family torn apart by his inability to commit, because Ridge was done with that cycle and he expected Thomas to be done with it too. But Thomas wasn't buying it, not really, not with the bitterness inside of him, not with the decades of Logan versus Forrester wars burned into his soul, and he fired back with disbelief that mirrored the skepticism of the audience, because no one watching this family's history could truly believe the merry-go-round had stopped turning, not when the wounds ran so deep and the betrayals were still so fresh. Ridge, trying to pull rank as a father and man of authority, cut through his son's anger with a dose of reality, reminding Thomas that he was a grown man, not a lost little boy anymore, and that his father's marriage should not be the obsession it had become.